The US is in a precarious position as it grapples with the dual challenge of maintaining the global dominance of the US dollar while trying to reduce its trade deficit and revitalize domestic manufacturing. Former President Donald Trump has warned that if BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, countries refuse to continue using the dollar for global trade and pursue an independent currency, he will impose a 100% tariff on imports to the US. This threat would effectively isolate countries from the US consumer market, as most global trade transactions are conducted in dollars. This presents a paradox. While the US wants to bring back manufacturing and increase exports, forcing the world to use dollars for trade can undermine that effort. The global trade system is built on the dollar as the reserve currency. As the US runs a massive trade deficit, dollars flow out of the country to foreign markets, and many of these dollars are reinvested in US assets, particularly stocks. The dollars used in trade are recycled back into the US, keeping Wall Street's markets high. But if the US imposes tariffs on BRICS, it risks cutting off the dollar's flow into global trade. As countries begin to shift away from the dollar, particularly through increased use of the Chinese yuan, RMB, the demand for the dollar could shrink. In fact, over 50% of China's cross-border trade is already conducted in its local currency, and this trend is growing rapidly. This is a risky strategy for the US. If the global use of the dollar diminishes, it would create a shortage of dollars in circulation, potentially causing a crisis. Countries may have no choice but to dollarize or find alternatives for trade, and the yuan is the obvious candidate. With China increasingly using its own currency for trade, the US may find itself losing its ability to exert global economic influence. The consequences of such a shift would be felt in the US economy, particularly in the stock market. A reduction in the dollar's dominance could lead to a collapse in stock prices, as fewer foreign investors would be eager to buy US assets. This would further compound the economic challenges of reducing the US trade deficit while simultaneously trying to revive American manufacturing. Trump is caught in a dilemma. He can't have both. If he reduces the trade deficit and revives manufacturing, it could mean less demand for dollars globally, potentially harming US financial markets. On the other hand, trying to protect the dollar and the interests of Wall Street could derail efforts to bring manufacturing back home. The Biden administration's tariffs are already having an effect on global trade. In October 2023, the US trade deficit fell by 12%, with imports dropping 4%. This is significant because it signals that if the global demand for dollars wanes, the US could face a currency crisis. Trump, who wants a weaker dollar to fuel industrial reforms, is now in a position where he must balance multiple competing interests. If the US were to continue its tariff policy, it could further reduce global demand for the dollar, impacting US Treasury yields. As global borrowing costs rise, this could lead to a debt crisis in the US, making it even harder to finance the manufacturing revival that Trump wants. But that's not all. China is leveraging its control over critical minerals, such as gallium, germanium, and other rare earth materials, to gain an upper hand in the global tech war. These minerals are essential for manufacturing advanced semiconductors and military equipment. Without access to these minerals, US semiconductor production could be severely impacted. China's ban on exports of critical minerals to the US is already affecting industries that depend on them. For example, germanium and gallium are vital for the next generation of advanced chips, which are used in everything from smartphones to military technologies. If the US is unable to access these minerals, the cost of manufacturing chips in the West will skyrocket, threatening both domestic industries and global exports. China's control over other critical materials, such as graphite and cobalt, is another strategic advantage. The US relies on imports for nearly 100% of its supply of graphite, a key material for both semiconductors and electric vehicles, EVs. China controls over 70% of the world's graphite production, giving it significant leverage. Additionally, China is expected to dominate cobalt production in the coming years, a key element in the production of EV batteries. If China decides to impose export bans on these materials, the US could face severe supply chain disruptions, driving up costs for domestic industries and limiting the potential for US exports. The Biden administration's efforts to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to the US have been hampered by China's control over these critical materials. Companies like Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, are already receiving billions in subsidies to build plants in the US, but China's mineral bans are making it harder to execute this plan. US semiconductor production costs could increase significantly, making it difficult for the US to compete in global markets. The broader implications of these supply chain shocks are profound. While the US may be able to wield the dollar as a weapon through sanctions, it cannot easily replace the supply of critical minerals controlled by China. If the US continues to push its trade policies, the result could be higher production costs, greater inflationary pressure, and a loss of competitiveness in key industries, particularly semiconductors and EVs. In the long term, this could weaken the US economy and erode its industrial base, while China and other BRICS nations move closer to securing their own economic independence from the dollar. Trump's decision on how to handle the BRICS nations and the global use of the dollar will have far-reaching consequences. If he moves forward with tariffs, it could accelerate the global transition away from the dollar, harming US financial markets and trade relationships. If he chooses to protect the dollar, it may harm efforts to revive manufacturing and reduce the trade deficit. Ultimately, the US is faced with a difficult choice between maintaining its global economic dominance and addressing its domestic economic challenges. As the US economy enters a period of uncertainty, China's strategic moves in the trade and tech wars highlight the growing global shift toward alternatives to US hegemony. The US cannot continue to have it all. Either it will need to prioritize its role as a global financial hub or its efforts to bring manufacturing back home, but the two may be mutually exclusive. The future of the dollar, US manufacturing, and global trade is at a crossroads. How the US handles the next phase of the trade war and its relationship with BRICS and China will determine the shape of the global economy in the years to come. The US is now in a race against time to adapt to a rapidly changing global economic order.